Let's dive into calls. We're going to take Robert, they from California, who wanted to add to your point, Jim, that you made about Alexander the Great on another show.
Yeah, I think, Robert, I think first you're going to have to remind me what the point was. I'm sorry.
You want me to backtrack a little bit? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, please, because I don't remember what the comment was.
This was last week. The person said, claimed, as so many theists claim, that there's no evidence for the existence of Alexander the Great.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. Claim I've heard many times.
Yeah, and they usually say that there's only one, and there's really 6, and then we have some archaeological evidence as well. So, yeah.
Yes, it's the art, and what surprised me, because frankly, I found your answer weak, is that you didn't bring up the archaeological evidence, which is the best evidence. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, it was. But also, if I remember that conversation correctly, I really kind of wanted to stay on George Washington and the difference rather than go too deep into Alexander. But if I remember the conversation correctly.
But your caller mentioned Alexander.
Yeah.
Yeah. George Washington, there are a whole bunch of things that are said about him are completely untrue.
That too. Yeah, despite all the great evidence of the things that he did say, the things that he did do, we have a whole host of stuff that he didn't say and didn't do. So, yeah.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, with a lot of our founding fathers or heroes, the stuff attributed to them, there's no record of. But would you like me to discuss George Washington or Alexander the Great?
Alexander the Great, why not?
Excellent. Okay. For example, there's a reliefs at the Shrine of the Bark at Luxor in Egypt, which mention Alexander by name. And these date back to Alexander's time. Secondly, there's a Mesopotamian tablet. I've looked up the archaeological number, BM 46761, which mentions Alexander by name. And the entry parallels the later accounts of Plutarch and Arrian, which are our main sources for, Alexander the Great, the information. I hope that was clear.
Pardon?
Hello, I hope that was clear.
Yeah. There's the Egyptian stuff, and then we've also got some evidence all the way from India, where we've got some evidence of him as well. Campsites, and then also I believe there's some writings that far. So the question is if
there's an excellent book. It's called Alexander of Macedon by Peter Green, who lists all of that. And that's why I get very pissed off when I hear that argument, because it's fallacious.
Yeah.
For the simple reasons. The evidence goes against it.
Right. And there's 6 different authors that give us, and I believe most of them are historians, or several of them are historians. So they actually, tell us where they got their information from. We may not have those sources, but I mean, they're not making up stories, or they're at least don't appear to be making up stories. And so again, we apportion our confidence to the evidence. And it, all of this leads us to a high confidence that Alexander the Great actually lived, actually did some things, and actually, we would have to explain why we see Greek army campsites on a more or less the path he took to get to India, according to the stories. There's so many things you have to explain, like what was he doing in Egypt? How did he get put on the stela and all this if he wasn't who history thinks he was, right? It's entirely possible that it was a different Alexander too, but until we have evidence to suggest that, we don't have any reason to believe it. So no,
absolutely none, because they're not going to refer to him just as Alexander. There's going to be something else to describe him,
right? Exactly.
But my point, getting to yours, that Mesopotamian tablet, the account given in that parallels the later accounts of Plutarch and Arrian. Now, Plutarch sometimes is not the most reliable, but in this case, I'll believe him because of the archaeological evidence which endorses him.
Right.
Yeah, and I obviously agree.
And those are all different authors, unlike what we have for the Bible proving Christ, right? We have one account, Mark, and then we have Matthew, which is 80% or better word for word copy of Mark. Luke and John are also copies to slightly lesser degrees, but are also copies. And so those aren't independent authors, right?
Except John, I have to disagree with you. John is completely different from all of the others.
You're right. Yeah. And Luke is too. Yeah.
John is entirely different. I could go through the Gospels. I mean, you see character development in all four of them. The Jesus, in the first Gospel of Mark, is very secretive. He keeps saying, well, here I perform this miracle, and I want, but I want it to be kept secret. The God, compare that to the Jesus in John, who's epidictic. In other words, he likes to display.
Yes.
To show off.
Yeah, he is much more the Jesus is portrayed in the Mel Gibson movie. I like to think of that opening where it's just his feet walking in the sandy or in the dusty street, almost as if it's a Western face-off, right? Gives you that kind of vibe. He's much more that character than he is, don't tell anybody I'm doing this, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's more in the Mark tradition.
Yeah.
And then if you notice that, I mean, you're right about the copying. But notice but there's enough difference. And notice how the character develops.
Right. Well, also, it's not just the character that develops, right? It's also almost like somebody saw Mark and then went, oh, hey, how do you know he died? Well, he was buried in a tomb. Well, how do you know his body wasn't stolen? Well, there were Roman guards, right? And so you almost have apologetics happening within the stories themselves.
Well, yeah, I would say so, because what were the Gospels? There were advertisements. That's all they were. Advertisements for Christianity. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they were written for the purposes of theology and not history, right? They weren't written to be historical evidence. They were written to be theological documents. Like much of the Bible was more about theology than it was about writing history. And I think that works too with with how we tell stories, right? Storytellers often adjust their stories to the listeners, either by using familiar landmarks or familiar names or things like that. They'll make slight changes to make the story to appease the audience more and to get the audience more interested in the story and to tell a better story in many cases. And we see that kind of thing. When the Last Supper was is kind of a question, because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it was before, not before the Sabbath, it was before the Passover, and John. I forget which way it went, but three of the stories have the Passover on the wrong or have the Last Supper before the Passover, so that Jesus could be killed on the Passover because he's a sacrificial lamb. So, that's kind of that there is theology. It's not about when was the actual Last Supper, when, was it Friday, Saturday, or Sunday when Jesus died? Those are the questions that we have. And yet the stories don't match up, in part because in the case of John, he's trying to make Jesus to be the sacrifice. And you can't have a sacrifice that doesn't happen, on Passover. So yeah, all this, the stories are just a different set of documented evidence that don't quite make it to good evidence that Jesus Christ existed as anything other than a man around whom stories grew up. And we just covered that, George Washington, that whom we have great documentation for. And, we have multiple heads of state. We have friends of his in other countries. We have his, and his own, and letters back and forth from people he was writing. They wrote back, and mentions in newspapers and all kinds of good stuff. And yet we have a whole body of myth and legend around him that came up. In a short period of time, right?
I'm sorry, what?
And in a short period of time. Yeah, we're here.
Yes, because Washington died in 1799.
Right.
So that's but with George, like for example, the story of the I couldn't tell a lie story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's Parson Weems. That came out afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, that never happened. Throwing $1 across the Delaware. Try it sometime if you're ever in the area.
Yeah. A coin would still be difficult, right?
$1, it would be impossible. There are a number of things. I mean, but again, out there, most of the stuff we have about George, it's pretty true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
it's just, it did take long it did take long for myth and legend to build up. He wasn't seen as a holy character like we have in the Bible. So we don't have too many supernatural legends. We have some legends that are beyond human capacity, but I wouldn't say they're supernatural, like throwing a dollar over the Delaware River, never telling a lie. Those things are, I wouldn't call them superhuman, but they're not within the normal human bounds, right? There's no supernatural aspect to that. Whereas Jesus, we do have that supernatural aspect to it. So he gets to walk on water, calm storms, heal the sick, and do all this other stuff.
But if you notice in Mark, I mean, while there are miracles, there are fewer of them described than in the later books.
Yeah.
And that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. If you're expanding on the legend, or putting the legend together, like Luke does, then you're gonna pick and choose which ones you want. You're not gonna pick the legend of Jesus Christ being a 5-year-old and killing his teachers and then resurrecting them, right? Or I think he was 5 when he did that, depending on which gospel you had. You're just not gonna have that kind of stuff.
Well, almost. But there is the proto-gospel of Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's one of the books which never got in,
right?
The Apocrypha.
Right.
And I don't know if you've read it, but
I have not read it. But yeah,
there are 2 Gospels of Thomas, but I'm talking about the proto-gospel.
Okay.
And
I haven't read any of the stuff that's not in the Bible yet. So
yeah, I advise you read it. It'll be amusing. And Jesus is he's a brat in that.
Yeah.
And if you notice, there is nothing in the Bible about Jesus' youth.
Yeah.
Or how he grew up.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting too, right? If you're trying to do a complete, you do cover where he came from and what made him unique and influences like that. We just don't have anything till he's 33 and he just kind of shows up on the scene. We get a little bit about his birth, and then we get his birth, and then we get 33, and 2 stories about what happened in the meantime. Right? One, he ran away to Egypt. One, he didn't.
out of curiosity, there's a story in the Bible which I can definitely disprove, and not because it's supernatural.
Maccabees.
Do you want to know what that is?
Maccabees.
No.
Okay.
Okay. If you go to John 3, we were discussing this gospel. John, he has a conversation with Nicodemus.
Okay.
And Jesus says, or it is translated, you must be born from above. But Nicodemus misunderstands it to mean you must be born again. Now, the point is that in Greek, the words for from above also mean again. Whereas if they'd been speaking Aramaic or Hebrew, you wouldn't have the problem. The point is, would two Jews at that time have been speaking Greek to each other?
Yeah, I don't know.
Probably not.
I mean,
But here it is. They're having a private conversation.
yeah. Yeah, but
Yeah,
I mean, the
so,
Jews
I
were
mean,
pretty Hellenized. Well, but they weren't educated. So yeah, they probably wouldn't be speaking Greek if they weren't educated.
They would have spoke either Hebrew or Aramaic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Richard, you're being awfully quiet over there.
What?
I wondered when someone was going to bring me in. I find this whole thing very, the whole kind of place where they go, very interesting, and even without kind of delving in to the Alexander the Great thing so much, I find the fact that they try and use him quite dishonest, because
You're right.
even if they think that Alexander the Great, there isn't much evidence, or even if they think there's no evidence incorrectly, as you've both already pointed out, if they think there's no evidence for Alexander the Great, why don't they use Cleopatra as a comparison to Jesus? And the reason they don't use Cleopatra as a comparison to Jesus, who was much closer in time to Jesus, by the way, than Alexander the Great. There's only 30 years difference between her death and Jesus' alleged birth. The reason they don't use someone like Cleopatra is because we have thousands of lines of evidence for Cleopatra, not just from historians, but from her own time. We have different styles of busts. We have some in the Greek style. We have some in the Egyptian style, which were commissioned to look like her. We have carvings on the sides of pyramids showing her and the sun, with literally carvings that were done in her own lifetime. We have coins. We have so much we know of all about her line, the Ptolemies. We have so much to demonstrate. And you would think if someone was going for a fair comparison of two figures in history, they would use two that were very, very close together, two that were geographically very, very close together. And it seems blatantly obvious the reason they don't use Cleopatra and they like to jump to people like Alexander the Great is because they don't want a fair comparison. What they want to do is to try and throw as much out there as possible to legitimize Jesus as much as possible. So what's the best way of doing this? Look for the one that you've been told, because they clearly haven't read the research themselves. Or, as you've both already commented on, they would have the coins with Alexander's name on from the time. They would have the archaeology. They would already have this stuff. So they wouldn't use it as a comparison. They'll listen to crap internet apologists who throw out Alexander the Great had no evidence, so why do you believe in him and not Jesus? It's nonsense. It's dishonest. And, if you are one of those people who thinks that that's a good argument, give us a call. We've got someone pulling us up, pulling one of the hosts up on not giving enough evidence for Alexander the Great. And where are the Christians here? Where are you defending these claims? If you're one of these people who think this, call in. Give us that evidence. But it seems wholly dishonest to use that, to try and use Alexander the Great. That's really my only opinion on this whole thing. I think it's a silly argument to begin with.
I do too. You said nothing, which I disagree with. But I would like to add something. That term Cleopatra, if I remember from my readings of Egyptian history, ancient history, there were about 8 queens who had that title. I just thought I'd let you know that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair point.
Yeah.
But and I look at it this way: if people have to lie about something to defend it, it's not worth anything what they're defending.
Yeah, I agree, and or at least misrepresent the facts or misstate the facts because they haven't actually done the research, right? I mean, it's entirely possible that whoever started there's only one source for Alexander the Great probably only knew of one source and was speaking off the top of his head. Now it gets repeated over and over and over again. We were talking earlier, Richard was talking earlier about, hosts being wrong and people being wrong. And that's why you should always fact check everything. Go back and double check your sources before you repeat it. Otherwise, you are repeating inaccurate information. Don't know if you're lying or not, because I don't know if you know the truth. But I mean, Richard and I talk, in this format, talk off our top of our heads all the time. And we probably say things that aren't quite exactly as true as we would like them, if we're not careful.
Yeah, I agree. Check. My saying is, however simple, it starts with the facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's no way of getting around that.
Yeah. And that's
why would you want it not to? Though this is the thing that I don't understand. Why would it, regardless of what position you're coming from, whether what worldview you've got, what religion you follow, if no religion, anything, why would you want to go out there onto a public forum and make statements and try and at best, let's be generous. Some of these people are just phoning to genuinely convince us of their deeply held beliefs, and there are other ones who are calling us to try and ridicule and who will blatantly, as we know, lie to kind of get the point across. But why would you want to go into the public sphere and say something that you know is not true to try and win an argument? I've had debates with Christian apologists before.
You can ask.
The most recent one, who I will not name, who was immensely dishonest through that debate. And it's frustrating. And we don't want to play games of sophistry. We want conversations about what people believe and why they believe it. So why not just present it? And if you're right, you're right, and you can make us look stupid. And if you're wrong, you're wrong, and then it gives you an opportunity to learn.
Of course. But I think you should ask Donald Trump that question.
I'm British.
Yeah, let's avoid the politics for a bit. But yeah, I mean, but you could ask that of anybody, right? Of where did you get that information? Politicians are infamous for doing this kind of thing, where they are giving us part of the truth and only the part of the truth, But I think this is true of everybody, right? We're not as careful with our source material as we should be. We repeat things that we've heard, and sometimes we'll repeat them inaccurately. But at least, most of the time when we repeat things inaccurately here, we will correct it. And you may not know that we've corrected if you don't watch every show. Or in some cases, someone will make a mistake on TikTok and then correct it on this show, as has happened in the past. So, yeah, those are all things that happen, and unfortunately, we don't always go back and fix things.
Okay, even getting into the political realm, there is something that's going around, and it's untrue, completely untrue. That the Ku Klux Klan was formed by the Democrats.
That's the what Klan?
The Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, no, that wasn't Democrats. Who started that? Yeah.
No, I'll tell you, it was 4 people. It started in Tennessee. Pulaski, Tennessee was the name of the city. And this is in 1865. The war had just ended, and it was a bunch of people, 4 people, and they would just get out and and what would be a good term? It was nonviolent, and entertained themselves.
Right.
This we know because of later newspaper interviews of the same four people who happen to have lived for a while. It had nothing to do with the Democratic Party. But I've heard two people state it was founded by the Democratic Party to promote the Democratic Party. And that's deadly.
Yeah.
That's dangerous.
Well,
Agreed.
I know there's only one state that's actually banned the KKK, and that is Nebraska. And I believe it was done by the Republicans in Nebraska, who the Republican legislature, which I think is also the only state with a unicameral legislature. But yeah, they banned it, and they were Republicans when they did it, and they were all Republican members. So it was at least multi-party. I'm sure there are Democrats who belong to it because that kind of stupidity transcends political parties.
Yes, you're right. I agree. Yeah, but it's a dangerous thing to spread.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And let's face it, the Republican Party right now is in a position where the only thing they can do is accuse other people of doing the same thing they're doing.
Well, it's
and they're doing
a good Republican right now is a former Republican.
Yeah.
If I may, we have gone slightly off.
Yeah,
topic.
we're off topic.
I'm sorry.
I'm all for a good conversation about why Jesus Christ is wrong, but when we get into like current politics, we're not really, in the remit of what we want to be talking about.
Well, it's another example of they're even closer to us in time. I mean, the founders of the KKK were closer to us in time than even George Washington, and yet we have myth and legend building up, even though we have better sources for information, better sources, even in the 60s, the 50s, 60s, whenever it was created, we have better sources now, and we still have legends growing up. So how do you not have legends growing up about Jesus Christ? Even faster. Well, not faster, but over more time, with the primary form of communication being word of mouth, right? And we know that word of mouth is the worst way to transmit information. Because it will get corrupted in just 2 or 3 iterations, or 2 or 3 repeats. So how do you not get that, and how do you? Go ahead.
Because when you were going on, about people believing lies, spouting them. I'm sorry, but Donald Trump was just a perfect example.
Yeah.
That's fine, but it's not Talk Politics; it's Talk Heathen.
Yeah, and, exactly.
There are lots of other examples we could use other than current political candidates.
The question is how do you eliminate the myth, the legend, to get to the real person? And the only way you can do that is to look for documentation outside of, for corroborating documentation. And the only things that we have outside of the Bible are other people talking about the Christians, and not necessarily getting, they're not going and interviewing Christians in some cases. They're talking about Christians and what they think they believe. And some of that's been edited, right? Some of those things have been edited. So how do you eliminate legend building type stories from the real story?
Yeah, and we know how the Gospels were kind of put together anyway. We know that they started as oral traditions. We know that they were, they developed into written collections of miracle stories and parables and sayings. We know that we had written proto-Gospels, which preceded and served as sources for the Gospels. And we know that the canonical Gospels were composed from these sources. We also know that the 4 canonical Gospels were not mentioned until somewhere between 120 and 150 by Justin Martyr. That's, if we take the earliest of those dates, so 120, the year 120, that's 90 years after the alleged death of Jesus. That's 90 years in which these oral traditions, these written collections of miracle stories and parables, these proto-gospels
can get changed. They've got different influences coming into them. They're passing between different people. We know that the first, roughly the first 100 years of, Jesus, disciples for Jesus, if you like, were kind of largely Jewish. And after that period, then it started spreading outwards and moving away from that Judaism that it was part of. So we already have all of this information, which really, really informs us of all the chances and all the opportunities for things to be misconstrued, things to be passed down and misinterpreted, things to be made up to push a certain agenda. We know that all of these things had that time. That's 90 years since the Gospels were first mentioned by, as I said, I think it was Justin Martyr who first mentioned them. And that's a long, long time for that information. And this isn't like, to kind of keep away from the political stuff. This isn't Elvis Presley who died, and within a couple of years we already had rumors and ideas and
the day after his death we had rumors of him being sighted.
Yeah. Already, and this is a time when we didn't have that huge amount of media for one of the the icons of the media, and all that attention around it coming in, all those cameras, all those people following him. When that wasn't the case in Jesus's time. You had a few people who were followers of him and who kind of kept the dream alive, if you like.
Let me add something to what you were stating, and all of which I agree with. But notice, and Bart Ehrman's books are so good with this, the Christianity practiced during, let's say, about the time of Paul is completely different from the Christianity practiced nowadays in its various incarnations. Completely. The beliefs were different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely we were.
And they'd have been different from town to town, even though those towns were, next to each other geographically and had a road between them. The beliefs would have been different between the two because they still relied on word of mouth, right? They relied on people telling stories. So,
and frankly, they had so many different churches, those pastors, and I'm just using that term loosely, for want of a better one, probably made up a lot of things as they went along.
Yeah. Yeah. And they had to in some cases.
They made it up.
Yeah. Yeah. Without it, I mean, that's how legend building gets started, right? And they're not intentional lies. They're little white lies. They're little color to add to the story, right? They're things to make the story better and more relevant. Like I said before, you change the story to make it more relevant to your audience. And if you're an itinerant traveler, you're going to get an idea of what that town is about before you start telling stories, and so that you can make the story more interesting to the people who are trying to listen to you. I mean, that's just the basics of good storytelling. When people are were a lot more isolated than they are today. We think nothing of driving 4 hours and in 4 hours being 100, 150 miles away from somebody. Right. When the only thing you can do is walk at 4 miles an hour. A 4 hour walk doesn't get you very far. A day's walk doesn't get you very far. And so communities were a lot more isolated and they didn't travel as much as we do today. So you don't have a homogenous society like we do today in the United States or Germany or Europe, for that matter, is just because people travel more, because they can't, because cars go fast. So yeah, I think the new thing in that time period is going to be very fragmented.
Sure. I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said, but I wanted to comment on something that you made, that we don't have, that the works near to Jesus' time are considerably after Jesus' time. And you made a comment of that they mostly describe what Christians believed, which is true. We only have about 4 or 5 snippets. But I was wondering if you've read the one from, from Lucian called The Passing of Peregrinus?
No, I haven't. I haven't actually read the things. I've read people, somewhat on what people have said about them, but I haven't read them myself yet.
I suggest you do. You seem to be a type of guy who likes a great laugh.
I have a huge reading list. Richard, do you know anything about that particular?
I've not read that particular one, no, and I have done actually quite a lot of reading in this area, but I've not read this one.
Oh, Lucian's one of my favorite authors. Actually, he was a Syrian who was fluent in Greek, but it's hilarious. And notice when you read these, what they're saying Christians believe, they're very pejorative. They're looking down upon the Christians. Have you ever noticed that if you've read any of the snippets?
There's lots of things that we're given as from our Christian callers and Christian friends who are trying to give us kind of their interpretation of what went off that didn't actually happen in the way that they happened. They want to make out it happened. One of the examples is the kind of persecutions of the Christians. And which, of course, there was a persecution of Christians, but if you listen to Christians talking about it, they will say that they were persecuted because because they were Christians, and they weren't persecuted because they were specifically Christians. They were persecuted because they were taking in a place that was largely ruled by the Roman gods. Things were happening, natural disasters were happening. And because they weren't worshipping the Roman gods, they were seen as causing those things. They could have been any religion. It wasn't because they were Christian that they were persecuted. It was because they weren't following the Roman gods. And it's tiny, tiny details, subtle details like this that can change the whole focus of like how you understand history to have unfolded. But listen, we thank you. We're going to let you go, Robert. We do appreciate the call.
It's been a great conversation.
It has been a great conversation, and we do appreciate it. And there's so many things I could have kind of fit. We went into so many places. There was a great comment made about the fact that what modern Christians are following wasn't what the earlier Christians were following. And there's several ways you can take that. You can kind of look into the fact that modern Christianity was kind of influenced a lot by Platonism, and the whole concept of heaven, the soul going to heaven when you died, came from that. We could have gone to the fact that even before the Bible was written down in a single language, the Bible we have today was written down in a single language. We'd had places even as far away from the Middle East as Britain, where I am, where you had communities of Christian who'd already been practicing Christianity for 200 or so years without the Bible.
Right.
Through missionary work and through what they said. There's so much that conversation opened up that was really interesting, and we could have gone down for further routes. I would like to go down those routes with Christians to kind of get their take on it.
Yeah.
But I think some of that conversation is, they're really worthwhile having. Jim, what are your opinions on that before I do a few announcements?
So I know apologists like to make a big deal of how soon after Christ's life the stories were written. And I am actually less concerned about the time than the number of years that it passed through. Because that's where you're going to get the story change, right? Is when you go from the oral tradition, and we see that in modern times, like we said earlier, Elvis sightings of Elvis happened the day after he died, and so you have that's a modern equivalent of what could have been happening in Jesus's time. Rumors of his death happened, and then teachings, but all that happens through ears. And we know it doesn't take too many of those before the story gets distorted beyond the original. So it's less for me about time and more about how many years passed through it before it got written down. And then again, how do you extract legend building and story improvement from the original. And I don't know that we can, right, in this particular case. So
yeah, it's such an interesting area of investigation to go into. And as a caller said, I would recommend anybody do like a little bit of research into it. But I would just say, and this is a point I try and push all the time because the caller mentioned Bart Ehrman, and Bart Ehrman's brilliant. I'm not saying he's not, but there are Christian believing scholars who will. I've got two academic books on the formation of the New Testament. One is from Bart Ehrman. One is from a guy called John Drain, who's a Christian. And the conclusions they come to, because they are following the scholarship, they are following the evidence, is almost the same. So don't stay away from Christian scholars just because they're Christian. You are doing yourself a disservice. There are some really, really good believing scholars out there who can separate their belief from the evidence.